This week in wrestling history, I resurrected that segment last week after a long layoff. There's a lot of big events in wrestling history that happen each week, and I find myself wanting to talk about them, and I said, well, this is the perfect time to bring back this segment and talk about not everything, but some of the key events that happened that people may not be talking about, or maybe in some cases they are. 29 years ago this week, on September 9th, 1991, Ric Flair made his WWF debut in two places at once. He wrestled at a television taping in Ottawa, Ontario. This was the night they shot that angle where he instigated Roddy Piper at the announce desk. Piper was doing commentary with Vince McMahon and Randy Savage, and he just wanted to be left alone. He was trying to be on his best behavior. He didn't want to cause any trouble. Flair was coming out for what I think was his second match of the night, which never happened, because he moseyed on over to the announce desk and he was pushing Piper. He smacked the headset off his head. Piper stood up. He got in his face. He ended up hitting him with the belt. Big brawl broke out. Officials came out. And it saw Vince McMahon throw his headset down to go down below and try to calm things down. And Roddy Piper accidentally clobbered Vince McMahon from behind with a wooden chair. Smashed the chair right across his back. Broke the chair across his back. One of the earliest bumps that Vince McMahon ever took on TV. Not the earliest bump. I can swear I remember, and I could not for the life of me find it or remember what it was. Maybe somebody listening will. I remember years ago watching it on YouTube. It was a clip from a segment. Could have been early 80s. I'm going to say late 70s. I'm going to say it was late 70s. There was some kind of angle that took place that involved Vince McMahon taking what I believe that would have been his first bump. I just don't remember what it was. The point is, it was very rare. You never saw Vince McMahon getting physical, getting beaten up, or assaulted in any way. It became commonplace in the Attitude Era. But back then, that was different. And a lot of people didn't know that Vince McMahon was the owner. They just thought that, oh my God, they beat up announcer Vince McMahon. We had never seen that before. But Flair, came into the company and he took the big gold belt with him from the NWA. This was after he was fired from WCW after a disagreement with Jim Herd. If you hear Flair tell the story, he basically told Herd, I'm not coming in. They had been talking about a contract renewal for a few months, and I don't know exactly what caused Herd to either change his mind or go back on things, but Flair was like, well, look, if I don't have a new contract, then I'm not showing up. We can work something out where you want to get the belt. Herd said, well, then put the belt, I'm going to send somebody to your home to get the belt, and Flair was like, well, you can do whatever you want, but I put down a $25,000 deposit on this belt. I'm sure Jim Herd didn't realize that's the way it worked back then with the NWA. And so if you want to pay me my $25,000 back, plus, I think he said it was like 10 years worth of interest, you can have your belt. And that's when Jim Herd said, fuck you. And that was the end of the conversation. So Flair, in his mind, he had the belt. He had possession of the belt. He owned the belt. And the first call he made was to Vince McMahon. He said, hey, Vince said, so, you coming in for real this time? Because they had conversations previously. Flair almost came into WWE in 1988. Flair almost came into the company in 88. He would have come in to challenge Randy Savage for the championship at SummerSlam in 88. And he ended up, I don't know if he got cold feet, but however you want to describe it, he just opted to stay. He opted not to leave. I guess he got cold feet. So now Vince was like, are you really coming in this time? And Flair said, not only am I coming in, if you'll have me, but I've got the belt. And Vince said, really? He says, yep. He said, put it in the mail to me. That's what he did. He put the belt in the mail, or he FedExed it. And we saw Bobby Heenan tease for weeks. He would show the big gold belt on TV, and he was teasing that Flair was coming in. And what happened after a period of time, we got to see the big gold belt on WWE television. After a while, they started video distorting it, and they gave Flair an old WWF tag belt. And you could still see around the distortion. I mean, you could tell what it was. That was when I guess they reached a settlement and he was no longer allowed to use the belt, or maybe he didn't have possession of it anymore. But in any event, while that angle was going on at the tapings, that very same day, Ric Flair made his television debut on Primetime Wrestling. Bobby Heenan introduced him. Bobby had been showing that belt off for weeks. Bobby was going to be his manager, but he didn't last very long. He couldn't handle Rick, and so they had Mr. Perfect become his executive consultant while Perfect was out with his back injury. And a great little group was born. The Ric Flair, Mr. Perfect, Bobby Heenan faction, if you want to call them that, the consultancy. 19 years ago this week, on September 10th, 2001, the final ever edition of Raw is War aired on USA. The very next day, 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center and 1 into the Pentagon. And the following Monday, they dropped the war part of the name of the show, and it's been that way ever since. 3 days later, Smackdown aired live, becoming the first live sporting event of any kind to be held after the 9/11 attacks. I can't believe it's been 19 years. It really is one of those events that, if you live through it at the time, meaning you can just remember where you were on that day, everybody remembers. I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing. Everybody's got a story about what happened that day. I can't believe it's been almost 20 years since then. 20 years! It's insane. But SmackDown aired live 3 days later. This was the show where Stephanie McMahon, in one of the most tone-deaf, narcissistic speeches that I have ever seen, still to this day, in saying a few words about the attack. In fact, she might have been the first person they cut to for one of these interviews that they did throughout the show. They cut to her and she spent half of her speech, and she was only talking for maybe, 45 seconds, maybe a minute. And she spent half of her speech comparing what America was going through. The buildings in New York were still smoldering. Almost 3,000 people dead. And she's comparing it to what her family went through when the United States government came after her family during the whole steroid trial and steroid investigation. There is a reason that this segment gets mocked as much as it does. The dark match that night saw The Rock, as the WCW champion, beat Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was the WWF champion. Those were very strange times indeed. 15 years ago this week, on September 11th, 2005, what a lot of people would call the greatest match in the history of Impact Wrestling took place at the TNA Unbreakable pay-per-view, a 3-way main event involving AJ Styles, Samoa Joe, and Christopher Daniels, 3 of the very best independent wrestlers at that time in the world who had been signed by TNA, went out there, and they had, by what every measure would be described as a 5-star match. Just a fantastic match, and it was a big deal at that time because it was a rare pay-per-view main event in TNA then that did not involve any big-name talent or any ex-WWE or WCW guy. There was no Jeff Jarrett or Kevin Nash or Sting or anyone like that. Just 3 young guys that they could build the company around, and in many ways they kind of did, especially with Joe and with AJ. And 8 years ago this week, on September 10th, 2012, on what was scheduled to be Pat Patterson Appreciation Night in Montreal, even Bret Hart flew in for the show, Bret's first appearance on WWE television in Montreal since the Screwjob. Now, Bret did appear on TV, but the Patterson Appreciation stuff, which I think was going to be an off-air thing when the show was over, that never happened. That never took place because of something more important that happened that night. Jerry Lawler teamed up with Randy Orton on Raw that night to take on CM Punk and Dolph Ziggler. And Dolph Ziggler was dropping elbow after elbow after elbow on Lawler's chest. But they had the match, and I think Lawler and Orton won, and there was nothing really out of the ordinary. Lawler looked fine, everybody looked fine, everything was perfectly normal, and Lawler ended up going back to the announce desk to continue doing commentary for the remainder of the show. And there was a match later on, tag team match between Team Hell No, Kane and Daniel Bryan, against the Primetime Players. And while the match is going on, Lawler, his voice starts to kind of trail off at one point, and then you hear these weird noises and what sounds like snoring. Sounds like Jerry Lawler has fallen asleep and has started snoring. And Michael Cole, even in recounting the events of that night, says that he thought King was just kind of being funny. He was making fun of the heels during the match and how unexciting they were, and he was kind of pretending to fall asleep. But that's what it sounded like. And I take it that what it really was is because he was deprived of a lot of oxygen. His heart was working so hard. He was trying to breathe and he couldn't breathe. And that's really what the noises were. But he went into cardiac arrest. And he ended up passing out at the announce desk. Michael Cole immediately knew something was wrong. I guess they have maybe a button under the desk that he pushed. He's waving for help. And it was a very scary situation. Lawler was clinically dead for over 20 minutes. They were doing the shock paddles. They were trying to bring him back. And still to this day, he has no memory of wrestling that night or anything that happened. His last memory was being on vacation in Aruba the week before with his girlfriend. When he woke up, he thought that they were either in Aruba or they had just come back. That was the last memory he had. And Dr. Sampson, who now works for AEW, he was the one who, his name was brought up last week. He was the one who cleared Matt Hardy to keep wrestling in that match with Sammy Guevara last weekend. He's the one who was on the scene. He was the ringside doctor. He immediately jumped to action. And he's the one who was credited with saving Jerry Lawler's life. I'll tell you what, Lawler is very lucky. If that had to happen, he's very lucky that it happened in Monday Night Raw and not one of the independent shows that he was still wrestling on every single week. Because if it happened on one of those independent shows, and a lot of those independent shows, they don't have the budget to have a doctor on call or an ambulance waiting. And it wasn't apparent immediately exactly what was going on, or maybe he slumps over and people think he's selling and he's working. If that happens on an independent show, Jerry Lawler ain't here right now. He very likely is not here right now. I actually had the chance to talk to Dr. Sampson over WrestleMania 29 weekend. I was with a bunch of my buddies, Noah and Brian and them, and we were walking along and we see Dr. Sampson walking the floor at Fan Access. This was in New Jersey. And he's walking the floor, and we went over and we grabbed him for a few minutes. We wanted to just kind of talk to him and pick his brain, and this was less than a year after the incident with Lawler. And he told me that he wouldn't even think about clearing Lawler for an in-ring return until at least a full year had passed, which would have been that September. WWE, to my knowledge, still to this very day, and it's been 8 years, and they still have not allowed Lawler to wrestle a match or cleared him to wrestle a match on TV, although he has wrestled plenty of independent matches. He may have even done some stuff in WWE, like some angles and stuff where there was some physicality involved, but I don't recall, unless I'm just completely blanking out, I don't think Jerry Lawler has wrestled a single match for WWE since the incident. But he loves wrestling. This guy's going to wrestle until he drops. That's just how some of these guys are. And he's still doing indie shots, if not every weekend. He's still doing them every month. So Lawler is still very active. Lawler was on the Broken Skull sessions with Steve Austin on the WWE Network. They just put that one up, I think, last weekend. And so I watched it. It was very good. It was actually very enjoyable. If anyone is looking for another feature on there to take time out to watch, that one runs about an hour and 20 minutes. I think it's worth your time. They spent the majority of the time on there, surprisingly enough, just talking about Memphis. Then obviously the Andy Kaufman angle. But they spent more time talking Memphis than I figured they would. Nothing about his feud with Bret Hart. That was kind of a big thing that they omitted. The one thing I will say is, and it kind of takes you out of it, he was talking about what it was like to, how he ended up getting into the announcing stuff. because he never wanted to be an announcer. And to this day, Lawler says he does not like announcing. He just doesn't like it. If it were up to him, he wouldn't be doing it. He would be wrestling. He wants to be a wrestler because that's what he is. But he fell into the announcing thing because Randy Savage left and jumped to WCW. Macho Man was doing commentary with Vince McMahon at that time in '94. And he's told this story before, and I just kind of wonder if his memory is faulty and you say something enough times, you start to believe it to be true. Which I think might be the case with Hogan. And a lot of the stories that Hogan tells, you tell a story enough times, it just becomes fact in people's memories. The way he told the story about what happened with Savage is, they were at Raw. Nobody knew where Randy was. Everybody's asking around, where's Randy? And then somebody had the TV on, and over on the other channel, there was Macho Man. He popped up on Nitro, and it shocked everybody. And Vince said, King, I need you to kind of sit in and help me out on commentary. And it was only going to be a temporary thing. And of course, it ended up becoming more than just temporary. But that timeline is completely screwed. That timeline makes absolutely no sense. Nitro did not even debut on TNT until the following year. And if I remember, I think Savage's first appearance was on WCW Saturday Night. It wasn't even on Nitro. It couldn't have been on Nitro. There was no such thing as Monday Nitro in 1994. So it's possible that he is remembering some variation of that, maybe. But that story is just so wrong. I don't even know where to begin. I will just chalk it up to him having a faulty memory. But I'm sure a lot of people were shocked when they saw that. And that was probably in Vince McMahon's eyes a big betrayal because Randy was almost like family to him. You look around on YouTube, you'll find there's this one clip of one night after a show, after a taping, somebody had a camcorder or whatever, and this would have been '94. And they're videotaping Vince McMahon, Pat Patterson, and Randy Savage walking into a Denny's after a show. You know, probably sitting together and talking about the next show or something. I mean, he was part of that inner circle. And so for him to leave and go to the competition and probably not give them a heads up that he was doing that, which I don't think he was obligated to do, probably was a pretty harsh betrayal in Vince McMahon's eyes. You know, but Randy wanted to wrestle, just like Lawler. He didn't want to do commentary. Vince McMahon thought that his expiration date had passed. It's time for the new generation. And I agree, you always want to be pushing new stars, but you don't think that Randy Savage, still being allowed to wrestle and maybe work with guys like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, couldn't have helped elevate those guys even a little bit more? But that wasn't the role, I guess, that he had in mind for him, and Randy said, adios. And he went to WCW and he made a lot more money and held a lot more world championships.